Popular YouTube philanthropist MrBeast has built an image
MrBeast
on
accusing
being
him of homophobia and boy is it a reach!
But for youngsters like these, brought up in a world of dyads and transistors, there's nothing mysterious about a computer.
Hello ladies and gentlemen and welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time, and today we talk about some gentlemen, some articles, and a greater discussion that has been bouncing around in my mind for months that, given the events of recent, is finally deserving of my attention. Here and there I've dropped the mention of media, often in less than a favourable tone, and it does seem abstract to me that something which, before I started paying attention to on the internet, I was never really particularly bothered by, now really frustrates me as a medium. This is in part because I never really used it. My childhood experience of the PC constituted of FIFA Manager, RuneScape, Club Penguin, and a brief spell in a Call of Duty clan, a venture that will forever bemuse me, though it did yield some pretty epic throwing knife montages. I told you guys I was a man of many talent. But anyway, before I get lost in the forest that is my own ego, we were discussing the media. When I started using online sites, it rapidly became clear to me how many sites had agendas to put. I remember the 2015 UK general election when the Daily Mail posted on their front page a tactical voting guide on how to keep Labour out of number 10. Despite the fact that, as a radio host, myself at the time, I was not allowed to express any political views pre-election. The media do have an extensive freedom, and damn do they milk that. I realised it then, but I did just seem to leave it in the back of my head because I was fairly powerless at the time. No, not until the year of 2016 when I decided to pursue this damn YouTube dream did I start to assemble a list of qualms. Certain media, some more than others, seem to focus on reactionary titles, poor reporting, and the farthest reaching within their legal realms, aimed at masking fallacies with facts. Ones that which, although not libelous, I always found pretty manipulative. I think this has become even more apparent over the last few years, as certain figures have provoked that narrative into the open, bringing it into scrutiny. A person who has practically become the media nemesis is obviously American President Donald J. Trump. I don't want to go into too much detail about him because the topic just tires me at this point, but his election was not the most reassuring moment for the media, particularly as they were very hostile to him and his behaviour. I think that was a turning point when I realised that shit wasn't exactly working out the way I wanted it to. I wasn't particularly happy, but I did see it coming. So why am I here today? Well, many people disagree to the extent of the toxicity of modern journalism. However, one situation that brought creators near and far together was the situation surrounding MrBeast. Now, MrBeast is a creator who bases his channel in part around philanthropy, that is, handing out the dollar to the less fortunate. He often finds creative ways to do it, while balancing this with content based on ideas so absurdly intriguing they pull the views to fund his generosity. Although he does say that most of the money nowadays comes from the deals beyond the YouTube platform, as the monetization process has not been particularly merciful towards him. Either way, it's a reproductive process, and long may it last. The Atlantic must have seen his success and thought, how can we get a good spicy click out of that? And then thought, scandal. So reads the title. The popular YouTube philanthropist MrBeast has built his image on being a nice guy, but has a history of using homophobic slurs. What was his crime, you may ask? What heinous atrocity did he commit against the gays? Well, let's just say it wasn't quite on the level of Pogo. I jest, but nonetheless. MrBeast here called some people fags, the bastard. Either way, I'm glad that journalists have finally worked out how to use the advanced search mechanism. They should be able to dig out some tasty exposés even quicker. I think what made this article so identifiably bad is that it came out at a time where YouTubers haven't really been doing much wrong against someone who is spreading legitimate positivity, and the criticism was so insignificant that presenting it in a way was dishonest. It shows the media will never really lay off the platform. Those are my first impressions. However, for now I'll leave this information here. What we'll be doing is I'll be discussing the various techniques employed by the media and how to identify them, and then returning to the article and applying it there so we can nail down the little specific things that annoy us a bit more than others. The purpose of this video will be to respond to some of the media's claims, reveal the sketchy tactics, and hopefully raise some level of awareness, while also being able to distinguish good journalism from bad journalism. I'm sure there are some people who will point out this video may give the media some form of attention, and although that is true, if I can convince a long-term mindset when approaching this topic, then I consider that to be greater than any short-term traffic that may be given from this video. It's also important to remember that primarily these videos are for your entertainment. I know I can't give that to everyone, but if enough people take something away, then I'll classify that as a win, even if they get some additional attention from it. With that out of the way, I think it's time we get discussing how the media has worn down many within the YouTube scene with their articles. Let us proceed. In spite of our differences, as a premise, I still love YouTube. Execution aside, there are some truly excellent features that do make it a defining platform of our generation. You notice how I said our generation? Well, I always find that simple fact to be the Achilles heel, or one of the many Achilles heels. But you know what I mean nonetheless. Many people outside the YouTube demographic are never completely immersed in the intricacies, and that's alright, they probably have lives. But the media recognise this, and they're certainly not ignorant to how YouTube works, and so they abuse it, because it makes spicy drama. This was illustrated in the demonetization scandal last year, which in my opinion really galvanised a turbulent relationship between YouTubers and the more mainstream media on two levels, which I'll clarify after this next story. Now, make no mistake, what happened with regards to demonetization was completely inevitable. It was a wrong that needed to be corrected. It's just a shame that corporations became so paranoid about it. In spite of the fact that there was always a situation, the reactionary press sensationalized it to be something greater, scared off multiple advertisers who came back very dubiously and threatened a platform that we know and love. I don't think anyone felt it was unjust that it had been reported on. There were plenty of content creators who were publicly calling out the platform on how they monetize certain content, but it was how it was presented and their motives for presenting it. These advertisements being put on content shouldn't have meant anything catastrophic to the companies behind them. After all, they don't select the ads, they just select the general company to promote on. But many of the businesses were afraid that people would wrongly create such an association and thus avoid the brand. Although this was most notoriously associated with the Wall Street Journal, this was originally reported on by The Times on February the 7th, 2017. But why does everyone seem to have such a hate boner for the Wall Street Journal in particular? Out of all the various publications, it seems a strangely specific grudge. Well, this is where we discuss how a situation can be manipulated. The Wall Street Journal introduced themselves not with the story above, but approximately a week later with a report on PewDiePie over the controversial Fiverr gig. This is the first one that slightly vexed people. They essentially posted a story and took credit for his sacking from Maker Studios. Now, as far as Maker Studios goes, they're a private company and they can do what they want. I can see why they might not want to support that sort of content, but I also think there is a perfectly justified anger at what the Wall Street Journal did. They essentially called into your employer to get you sacked, not because anyone writing the actual report was hurt or upset by the video in question, but because it would make a spicy story. If any of them actually cared, they wouldn't have waited a month before the topic of YouTube was galvanized by the Times before putting in a call. It seemed opportunistic and rather expedient. People don't like that, regardless of what they may think of a distasteful joke. In the article, they also claimed that PewDiePie had made 9 videos with quote anti-Semitic jokes or Nazi imagery, a claim that was lambasted by basically everyone. Let's just say they're operating some intense ratios on their YouTube channel. But you do remember there being a Wall Street article written on the topic of YouTube demonetization, right? After all, that was what the whole H3 debacle was about. I'll refresh everyone's memory. You see, on March the 21st, over a month after the original problems were surfaced by the Times, Google's chief business officer Philip Schindler addressed many of the concerns on a blog post that explained the changes that they would be making. Now, for anyone with decent YouTube experience, they understood what this meant. Not everything will be immediately sorted, but with the patience of those around them, this will be resolved. This is where the journal irritated people the most, because what they did is they waited a few days and then dropped the story that said, "Oh my god, we can't believe this is still happening." Unfortunately, this was going to be overshadowed by H3's rather terrible blunder. However, that does not make the article any better, nor any less of another opportunistic grab. It would not surprise you that one of the people who wrote the first article also wrote the second one. It felt cheap, everyone anticipated that nothing would be solved immediately. I'm sure the Wall Street Journal did too, but this sort of fearmongering seemed highly dishonest. There was a very small minority of content that the Wall Street Journal had picked out with a fine-tooth comb and overstated their influence. With many of the safeguards YouTube have in place, the examples were just a case that could be found on many domain sites that anyone had free access to express themselves on. Even on the Times article, they note one other example that wasn't just YouTube related. It seems specific targeting for a general problem that can never be completely prevented, and that is why they still write articles about it to this day, even with the amount of safeguards in. Now, in hindsight, I'm obviously glad the current site setup is more secure than it was before. There was clearly content that I'm glad isn't being monetized. It was just a shame that 99% of creators were caught in the crossfire, and the journal did not seem particularly concerned about that. And listen, they can do what they want, free press, fantastic, but people are still going to judge them for it, and many feel they exploited the situation in true media fashion. People also felt like they were doing it because they were waning in popularity, and YouTube serving itself as heavy competition, particularly due to the move towards more opinionated commentators and a gradual distrust in the media, it seemed to add up for many creators, and given the effects of the Wall Street Journal's reports, people felt a disdain towards them. It didn't help that YouTube were absolute pushovers, but people were already convinced of that before the scandal, so this was not news to them. With that said, despite their icon status, I actually think the Wall Street Journal were not necessarily the worst offenders in every field. What they did, I felt, was in complete contempt, with plenty of manipulative tactics that I will be addressing later. But really, I think the worst thing about the Wall Street Journal that makes it stand out was that it was mildly effective. And although certain media since then hasn't been without any impact, most of it has just deflected off, and therefore been forgettable. But it doesn't excuse some of the atrocious hot takes that currently exist on this wretched planet. And since the main Wall Street Journal scandal, plenty of media have tried to cash in on the popularity of YouTube-related articles, and I've decided to split them into two categories: the old media and the woke media. And I do this because I think the Wall Street Journal saga brought an interest from both sides. There had been plenty of casual pieces in the past, but this was the controversy that brought the eyes onto YouTube, and has kept people invested even when there appears to be nothing worthy of reporting. The Wall Street Journal definitely bridged these two genres. An important point to remember is that plenty of articles mix these two, but these are the two most prominent approaches that I've recognized. I'm going to start with the old media because I don't really think the way I order these will make much difference, and it does lead me to a point that I'd never really considered until thinking about this topic. Being a YouTuber to many is considered an occupation, and when thinking about it, that as a classification is rather reductionist. I think the old media play this to the advantage on a fairly regular basis, the idea that people are just YouTubers, which although not necessarily untrue, is not really representing the variety of creators on the platform. Although I do think that those said creators do share part of the responsibility on the branding parts, a lot of us do like to flaunt the label. What this does though is create an image of a collective. This is especially effective when the audience you're talking to isn't necessarily familiar with the website. I think this is an important thing to note. When some twatty musician or actor is taken down for behaving in a shitty manner, people blame it on the individual, not on the industry. When a YouTuber does it, the accountability becomes a lot murkier. What do I mean? Things like this makes me think social internet programs should be shut down. It is so sad how so many people abuse the internet. Sometimes I wonder if the best thing would be to just shut the internet down. They are blocked in China, and many other countries are doing the same to protect their young generation. They do not meet the rules of respect. The world has gone to pots. These sorts of things should be banned and the sites taken down. So glad my kids are grown up and won't encounter these sorts of people. Can we just get rid of YouTube already? Quit giving these self-absorbed imbeciles a platform for their cruelty disguised as entertainment. And of course, YouTube cooperated in this repellent evil crime. I hope this person gets his head kicked off in prison. YouTube exists and thrives because of live action trolls like this. Hefty civil judgments against the ZZ hack content creators may be the best way to help them grow up quickly. Anyone who acts badly online should also have it recorded on their police record. You and Greg Paul both love. That last one isn't really relevant to the point I was making, I just found it very funny. It is important to note that this does not necessarily represent everyone's thoughts, and that there were many posts just bashing the individuals, but given the overwhelming support for these comments, it did seem important to include them as examples. These examples are not arguments against the publication because it's often an individual's responsibility of how they think, and the information presented wasn't necessarily misleading, but I personally believe that many of the beliefs held here are so baseless that they can only be the result of one-sided information. There were many more hot takes on this, millennials, the left, all that jazz. But these were the most YouTube-related takes, and it's amazing how YouTube and the internet has established itself as its own domain, despite the fact that a lot of people act as individuals on it. So to have the media create that label is kinda unique. I think in part it's due to the cultural monopoly and establishment that YouTube has. There is no site quite like YouTube. Much like some people were considered Viners, the website was part of the draw. It was its own genre, rather than it just being a subset of the genre. You wouldn't call the authors of the articles above Daily Mailers because they're just columnists, many of whom would be interchangeable on other competing websites. The form of entertainment that YouTube promotes is so unique that it has been given that label, despite the fact that there are many different types of entertainers on YouTube. The label itself underplays it and often leads to these distorted perceptions that we witness in the media, causing people to assume that YouTube is just some hub for millennial pillocks jerking each other off while filling Oreos with toothpaste and feeding it to homeless people. A statement only partly true. I jest once again, but my point still stands. I've noticed a huge increase in volume of these types of stories on sites like the Daily Mail, who didn't used to cover this, but now they're borderline acting as any trending topic channel, just for an outsider's point of view. And I am 100% serious about that statement. However, the audience naivety allows them to appear more unbiased or being very selective with the information they present, and therefore leading to a more inductive message about the greater state of YouTube, causing people to not see it in perspective. YouTube is still new to many people, and first impressions mean a lot. Just try not to get your first impressions through sites like the Daily Mail and you'll be alright. So while more traditionalist sites like the Daily Mail appeal to the less well-versed individuals on what social media is really like, what do you have on the other side? Well, you have people who clearly know more about the YouTube system, but are just inductive in so many different and irritating ways. Whereas our former example makes general statements about the platform, the woke media prefer to go after specific people with a personal grudge like no other. It'll often stem from the sort of very high detail probing journalism that I'm going to be looking into very soon, with numerous lines of reasoning which I find a tad tentative. Their technique isn't exclusive to YouTube. In fact, I've noticed it a nauseating amount of times at this point, but for some reason they do have specific distastes for YouTube. My general hunch is that it's because YouTube politically does have individuals who are less PC, and those who are not big on the journalistic agenda. Like the gaming industry, which I explained in my Bully Hunters video, it's a bit more blasé, and does have some fairly outspoken figures on some gaming related incidents. What I find the woke media to do is to take up the cause of something moral, and then make a ridiculous argument relating back to it, followed by a justification that bases itself in a logical fallacy, and then a conclusion that a person is doing something much worse than they actually are, while using the moral cause to fall back onto an at least existent amount of support. I thought we'd do a practical with this, as it happens on a fairly regular basis. One of the examples that epitomizes this to a recent extent was a situation with PewDiePie, in which Motherboard, the Vice-owned domain, took his video he made on Alinity, and well, the title clearly shows we're going to be in for a rollercoaster ride. Now what follows is a line of dishonest arguments that make mild comments seem like borderline hate speech. So let's use my little classification just to identify the little ticks that they've used here. What's the moral cause? Women's rights. I like women's rights. Sounds good to me, lads. What's the ridiculous argument? I mean, there are multiple ones, but for the sake of not prolonging this anymore, let's just say that PewDiePie is, quote, telling his audience that millions of men are not responsible for their actions, and that when women dress a certain way, they are asking for it. What is the baseless justification? Well, in this instance, it appears to be a slippery slope. That somehow PewDiePie pointing out that Alinity was behaving sexually, and not just a bra strap showing like this article implies, is somehow leading to people believing that women are asking for it when they wear revealing clothing. The author references comments that really don't prove anything other than the fact that they agree with PewDiePie, and even then, if they had been more vulgar, what would they have proven? Not much from my point of view, because most of PewDiePie's content was his opinion, and being persuaded by opinions is different to being persuaded by per se one-sided facts, as I noted earlier with my Daily Mail point. Opinions are by nature biased, and therefore unless the factual premises that you base your opinions in are misleading, then you can't really be prosecuted for other people judging the situation in your favour, whether it's done in an eloquent manner or not. You haven't proven that what PewDiePie said was overly one-sided or misleading, so you don't have the privilege to use fan responses as arguments. The only comment you claim to be taken out of context isn't provided with the context, so I can't really comment on it. But even then, it's a very, very small reason of why people might dislike her, and doesn't relate to any of the comments you cite. And before we get pulled away from what we're actually discussing, what is the idea that the individual in question has done something much worse than what has actually happened? Well, I mean, the author's slippery slope has already done that, but basically the author implies that PewDiePie is responsible for various abuse Alinity has received, and that he is part of the problem that causes streamers like her to be sexualized. This argument itself has been covered multiple times in depth, and I'll leave that up to you. But personally, I do recommend watching the video banning PewDiePie, and although I was intrigued by the article at first, watching the video gave it a lot of context that made me realize that this was some real grasping at straws. So now we've distinguished between the two. The old media rely on stating facts in a plain way that, although not necessarily false, can create a one-sided image that lead people to fill in the gaps with their own ideas of what YouTube is. On the other hand, the woke media tries to fill in the gaps themselves, but with ideas that appear so absurd to me, they really just seem like personal smear campaigns. So I thought I'd devote this next part to explaining various tactics that I've identified within the media, spot the little tricks, and then go and apply it to a little article that we mentioned earlier. Coming fresh out of the PewDiePie article, you probably remember that I used the phrase slippery slope. A slippery slope is an argument that basically one thing could have a greater collateral effect and thus lead to something worse. An example of this would be those who say that gay marriage will lead to the inevitable destruction of Western society. The slippery slope is one of the favourite tactics used by a lot of these publications, because by doing it they can make something out to be much more impactful than it initially would appear to be. Much alike to the people who use your political position to say how it could actually lead to Marxism or Nazism, even if you're not one of them yourself. The real issue is that a slippery slope can sometimes exist. It's just such a subjective concept that anyone can use it to their advantage to create enemies out of the most moderate people. I'd urge you to always check the source material in these instances, as context really shows whether it can be taken as or lead to something worse than it actually is. For my next part, I chose the recent Elon Musk debacle, in which he decided to take on the media in a series of tweets that went at them for their alleged dishonesty. Now, I must stress that Elon Musk is not a YouTuber, but as I said earlier, journalistic tactics like these are not exclusive to YouTube. They're a general thing, which I think is important to apply. Musk's idea of Pravda, which is rating the media on their trustworthiness, a separate site, is intriguing, although it would need much more elaboration before any judgment could be passed on it. However, the media were not happy, and they took up certain narratives that were fairly transparent. In fact, it was so transparent that it basically became a meme. Now, Elon Musk, regardless of whether his motivations were self-driven, which they probably were, said what a lot of people were thinking. His statement on how the media were lacking trust is fairly reasonable, yet many journalists decided to compare him to Trump. I wonder why. Basically, Donald Trump, as I said earlier, is another passionate critic of the media. He's also rich, like Elon Musk, and he's also not the most popular gent with many people. Yet Musk's and Trump's attitudes are completely different on many behalves. In fact, in what must be one of the worst attempts to dunk on Musk, The Guardian made a quiz of who said it, Donald Trump or Elon Musk, and I got full marks, not because I'm a super fan of either, but because they're really quite easy to distinguish on many halves. Anyway, besides the fact that Donald Trump and Elon Musk generally don't have that much in common, their arguments on this topic were similar. Heaven forbid you share an opinion on something. The media do this mainly to get the surface level impressions. People see a title like "What Elon Musk and Donald Trump Don't Get About Journalism," and it sounds like they're pals. Even though it's not necessarily wrong, it's manipulative. This article, which was randomly chosen, by the way, from a plethora of Musk-Trump articles, continuously references them as if for some reason Trump is a necessary inclusion. We already know Trump's criticisms of the media, as if he hasn't fucking tweeted about them enough. He has not presented anything new in the last few weeks, as far as I'm concerned. Also compare and contrast the descriptions of the characters within this article. On one hand, you have the thin-skinned Tesla founder and CEO, and the investigative news non-profit reveal, and they were merely reporting on safety issues. And in response, Elon Musk emulates the president. This is the sort of journalism that ticks people off, because it overrepresents one side and underrepresents the other. We see it all the time. These are the small things that grate on people. But some don't understand why it grates. Well, it's because these words, although not intrinsically false, seem cherry-picked to make one side seem good and one side seem bad. For example, I could describe H3 Productions as a comedian activist who invested hundreds of thousands of pounds to uphold fair use on YouTube. Or I could describe him as the alleged transphobe who falsely claimed the Wall Street Journal were faking their articles. Both of these descriptions are true, but they're not really representative of him. In fact, they're more representative of your own position. And that's what people don't like about these articles. They give away their bias in the most subtle way. Using words like meltdown to describe Elon Musk's response, saying that he was under pressure, dealing with very subjective, definitive concepts that don't exactly reflect the situation, will make the public reject them and recognize it as dishonest. A simple YouTube example of this would be when media covering the PewDiePie case classes anti-Semitic jokes as posts. Once again, although not false, it leaves gaps to be filled by outsiders. There was another story where Musk retweeted an article from a site with a rather sketchy reputation. Many journalists jumped on this in an attempt to dunk on him, but the public reception was lukewarm at best. It was a weak guilt by association argument that, even if true, didn't necessarily change the validity of his points. And when he did find out the website lacked reputation, he removed his endorsement. Most people do not look into the websites that they retweet, but more what they say. Should Musk have done that? Sure. But did that change the points he was making exactly? Not really, no. Even when you get to the opinion, they're ridiculously weak. One claiming that these journalistic websites couldn't be in the pocket of any fossil fuel or gas company because they'd written articles on some fossil fuel or gas companies. Now, despite the obvious fact that any media site could be in the pocket of one while smearing the competitors, the links that the author references have the most recent article on such a topic 2 years ago, which was about the Border Patrol Union, as if they'd be paying companies off, as if Elon Musk would be referencing them, and a majority of other articles that were around 10 years old, which genuinely proves jack shit considering they've written 3 articles about Tesla in the last 60 days. Now, I've gone off on a tangent, but please, just argue better. There is a greater point here. Certain journalists bank on appearing confident in their references, as a majority of consumers will not check them, and just assume that because they're cited, they must be alright. Having a link does not add credibility immediately. Check that shit, it might actually have the additional context you need to prove the opposite. The other thing is the titles, and this has been ran into the ground of recent. With the increasing volume of media, titles have become increasingly more clickbaity to bring in that traffic. So what? Most YouTubers use clickbait to some extent too, which is relatively true. The issue is that it's a different type of clickbait. The media have really capitalized on what I call fact baiting, which is this notion of stating something which is enough for people to respond to without even having to check out the actual article. And although the statement may not be false, it's manipulative or misrepresentative. And this is where we come back to MrBeast. I think it necessary to involve Twitter at this point, because Twitter has cultivated something very unique, which is retweet culture. Basically, an article is posted, and without necessarily reading or checking it, some people either retweet it or quote tweet it. Quote tweeting is the real interesting case, because people basically weight these provocative titles, quote them out, and dunk on whoever they don't like through it. It's an absolutely fascinating dynamic, but it's not particularly good for journalistic integrity. It basically encourages the spicy takes, because if someone can get that mad dunk, then they'll hit 50k retweets, and they'll be able to promote their SoundCloud.
Look, I know I carry been in my house, but I never run the sauce, cause I put up in this big gym now. Buy me a new pair of rocks, so shut the fuck up, cause they give me no fuck. Hey, nigga never cover no.
With the side effect leading to traffic for the article. Some people will be bound to do it. Twitter has 2 important factors. 1, an interest in social media, and 2, a rather left-wing audience. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that the hot takes are tailored to that demographic often. Let's have a look at the MrBeast title then. That is definitely asking for it, but it didn't work. Not this time at least. Why is that? Well, you know how I said the Wall Street Journal struck the sweet spot between old media and woke media? That sweet spot is not always there, and in this one, it's quite clear that they've missed the mark terribly. In spite of his significant subscriber base, he's still too niche for most people who read old media to be interested in, and he's too insubstantial to certain woke agendas to be worth their time either. With a fan base that is fairly apolitical, claims of homophobia do not concern them, especially with the evidence lacking, and therefore all you do was attract people who do have an interest in him, which for a large majority are people who will be defending him. When you read the article, the fact baiting made in the title becomes ever clearer. The claims of a history of homophobic comments amount to him using the word fag twice and also saying Windows is gay while mocking his own sexuality. Let's see what other techniques that we were discussing earlier we can notice here. Habit of calling people fags. Apparently a habit is something that you do twice now in observable history. Barely true. Jimmy showed no regret or remorse. This is a sort of statement loaded with the fact of something he didn't do. Let me state something else. Jimmy showed no pride or joy, both of which are true statements but send completely different messages. The only reason that you'd have to use such a statement is if MrBeast should be expected to show regret or remorse, and frankly, I do not think he should. Before they were made aware of the comments, 2 YouTubers told me they considered Jimmy to be kind, humble and earnest. I don't really need to respond to this comment, it's just so bloody stupid. But if you think that comments like those change a person's character, then I do not know what planet you're living on. But homophobia runs deep in the YouTube community. If you saw the reaction to Pogo, it's not a question of homophobia on the entertainment side of YouTube. It's a question of what people view as homophobia. Personally, I do not think this is homophobia, and to imply such I find a real watering down of what we view it as. There are so many statements that people on YouTube just don't seem sensitive to in the same way that many of the media are, and that creates a real disconnect. The author Taylor Lorenz says he regularly uses homosexuality as a punchline, despite the fact that the examples she lists are over the span of 3 years. Given the volume of your examples, how can you consider that regular? It is a rotten piece, not because anything in it is an explicit lie, but because it walks so close to the line of lying in an attempt to tell something mildly interesting. If we're reaching the point where such methods are being chosen over presenting facts in an honest and just way, in favor of just really lazy journalism piggybacking on moral causes, which it really has no actual vested interest in, must I remind you, that I'm not on board. It's taken something positive and said, how do we attack this character? Let me tell you this. This article said much more about your character than his. And that's the thing. When I made my Great Ball video, I assembled so many various ideas on how something can state a greater narrative about his character from the way he behaves. You literally just search MrBeast using the word fag. What does that say about him? If anything at all, it is just sad, miserable reporting. The problem is the industry has developed this whole technique of loopholes to not exactly lie, but convey information in a manipulative fashion. I don't think there's any way to regulate it, and I don't think you should, but more attention should be brought to it. So people's mentality in a way evolves as to not gratify the bad journalists in these endeavors. YouTube has appeared to be a particular target of the media, mainly because it finds itself too modern for many publications and their audiences, and too edgy for others. This does not mean that every article printed on a YouTuber will be badly written, nor does it mean that YouTubers will not be deserving of public criticism from time to time. Let me make that clear. People should be open to criticism. But when the BBC are claiming that YouTube could be encouraging kids to eat calories because they posed with unhealthy food, people become pissed off. And really, I find what I've said today more helpful in distinguishing the good from the bad. If you're reading an article, just see how it presents its arguments, how it uses that language, and how its references check out. It may not just be pivotal in defining your opinion on that situation, but on the credibility of what you're reading. Because at the end of the day, the news should not define your opinion. It should provide the foundations for you to craft your own opinion. But if you do see a good, honest article, go give it some love, encourage it, see who the author is, send them some love. Because that's what we need more of. For the media, for you, people have lost their faith, and judging from some articles, it's quite clear why. If you want to win them back, it's going to be a slow process, and the way you respond to criticism has not been working well either. However, that's a topic that I might just save for another time. I think you've suffered enough. I hope you can improve, because the media does play a necessary role in modern life, and people would love to be able to trust you. It's not like people enjoy being skeptical, it's just the position that you've put us in. Anyhow, this video turned out slightly longer than I intended it to be, but I found I had a lot to say. There were things that I planned to talk about that I didn't even manage to do that, so I guess I'll be saving that for another time. There's always more to discuss. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear. I tend to respond to a lot of comments in the first few hours, and then I'll let them simmer. However, you can still reach me on Twitter at The Right Opinion. I have open DMs, and on Facebook, I'll leave the links down below. I'll also be in my Discord sometimes, basically everything under the sun. Also, make sure you check out and subscribe to the editors if you have the time. They do a stand-up job in making this content come together, and it would not be the same without them, so please go and send them some love. With regards to the love, thank you for all the support. It has been great of recent, and honestly, it means the world to me. Please guys, do take care of yourselves. Until then, however, I'm The Right Opinion, and I'll see you in the next one.